Let me tell you what actually shapes your career. It's not the big moments. It's not the performance reviews. It's not the major projects. Of course, those matter, but your career is shaped by something much smaller and much more frequent: conversations. The conversations you have and the ones you avoid. Because here's what I've seen over and over working with ambitious professionals, that there are a handful of conversations that when you handle them well, they accelerate you. They accelerate everything: your visibility, your relationships with leadership, your trajectory. And when you avoid them or when you handle them poorly, they will stall your growth, sometimes for years. We're talking here about the 5 specific conversations that change careers: what they are, why people avoid them, and exactly what to say when you're ready to have them. So let's go. So here's what I see constantly with smart, capable professionals. They wait too long to speak up. They hope things will resolve themselves. They soften conversations that needed to be direct. They shrink from a moment that really required clarity. And it's not generally because they don't know what to say, it's because they're afraid of what happens if they say it. They don't want to create tension. They don't want to be seen as difficult or demanding or not a team player. And they don't want to get it wrong. They don't want it to backfire on them. So they wait and hope. But here's where it gets interesting. Researchers at Crucial Learning, an organization that spent decades studying high stakes communication in workplaces, they set out to answer a question that sounds simple, but it turned out to be surprisingly hard to study. And the question was, why do smart people avoid the conversations they most need to have? They surveyed thousands of professionals across industries and levels and organizations, and what they found wasn't what most people expected. It wasn't laziness, it wasn't lack of communication skills. The pattern that showed up consistently across almost every population that they studied was this: people avoid high stakes conversations primarily because they run a mental simulation of how the conversation will go. And in that simulation, they almost always imagine the worst possible outcome: the relationship damaged, the manager offended, the reputation negatively affected. And because that imagined outcome feels so real and it feels so threatening, they don't have it. They just choose silence every time. They don't have the conversation. But here's the twist that the researchers didn't expect. When they tracked what actually happened to people who consistently avoided difficult conversations versus the people who learned to have them, the outcomes were almost perfectly reversed from what the avoiders feared. The avoiders experienced more breakdowns in trust and more stalls in their career and more resentment building quietly in their professional relationships. Whereas the people who learned to have the hard conversations, they got the opposite. They got stronger relationships as a result. They got more visibility. They got faster advancement. So the thing that the people who didn't have the conversations, the thing that they were most afraid of damaging the relationship, was actually more likely to happen through avoidance than through honest conversation. I had a client who said to me that something I think a lot of people recognize, and said, I just keep hoping my manager will notice that I'm ready for more. And I told her, hope is not a strategy. Conversation is a strategy. Because your manager is busy. Leadership is busy. Nobody above you is spending their spare time building the case for your advancement. So that conversation, that is yours to start. And the good news is, once you know which conversations to have and how to have them, well, they're not as scary as your mental simulation made them feel like they would be. Let me give you the 5 conversations. These are the 5 that I've seen change careers repeatedly across industries and levels. And they're not complicated, but most people are having 0 of them intentionally. So Let's change that. The first conversation is the expectations conversation. And the question at the heart of this one is, what does success actually look like here? And here's why this one matters so much. Misalignment between what you think your manager wants and what your manager actually wants is one of the most common and most invisible career risks that I see. You're working hard toward a target, and there's a real chance it's not the target that your manager has in mind. And research on this is very, very clear. Studies on manager employee alignment consistently show that employees and their managers have very different definitions of what strong performance looks like in any given role. Even when they think they're aligned, the employee thinks I'm delivering, and the manager thinks they're not quite hitting what I need. And nobody says anything because nobody asked. This conversation is going to close that gap before it costs you. So here's what to say. I want to make sure I'm focusing on what matters most. Let's talk about what success looks like at the next level and whether the work I'm prioritizing right now is the right signal. That does three things simultaneously. It shows self-awareness, it demonstrates ambition, and it gives your manager an opening to tell you something they probably haven't found the right moment to say. Have this conversation and have it soon, and then have it again in 6 months. The second conversation is the visibility conversation. And the question here is, am I working on the right things? And are the right people seeing them? I've spoken in other episodes about why great work goes unnoticed, and this is the conversation that directly addresses that problem. Because here's the reality. Hard work without visibility is a career on a treadmill. You're moving, you're sweating, you're exhausted, and you're in the same place. This conversation is about getting honest input on where to focus and making sure that your manager understands that you're thinking about impact, not just output. So here's what you'll say. I'd love your perspective here. Where should I be putting my energy right now to have the biggest impact? And are there areas where I should be more visible? That second question is the one that most people never ask, and it gives your manager permission to be very direct with you, which is almost always more useful than the polished version of feedback that they would give if you didn't prompt it. The third conversation is the feedback conversation. And the question here is, what am I not seeing about how I'm perceived? And this one requires probably the most courage, and it delivers the most value. Here's some of the research that I find genuinely humbling. Organizational psychologist Tasha Eurich spent years studying self-awareness, specifically the gap between how we see ourselves and how other people see us. And what her research found was this: only about 10 to 15% of people are genuinely, accurately self-aware. 10 to 15%, which means that roughly 85% or more of professionals are operating with a meaningful blind spot about how they come across, about how they're being perceived, about the gap between their intention and their impact. And you cannot close a gap that you cannot see. So this conversation is how you find it and how you see it. So here's what you could say. I'm really focused on growing into the next level. If you were coaching me, what would you want me to strengthen? And is there anything about how I'm perceived that I should be paying attention to? And that framing matters. You're not asking for a performance review. You're asking for coaching. And that's a different conversation. And it typically gets a more honest and more useful answer because it takes the pressure off. The fourth conversation is the boundary conversation. The question here is, what can I realistically take on and what needs to shift to make that work? And I know this one makes a lot of high performers uncomfortable because high performers don't like saying no. They don't like admitting limits. They've built their reputation on being that person who doesn't put on those limits, the person who figures it out no matter what. But here's what that overcommitment actually costs you. When you're maxed out on execution, when your plate is completely full, over full, you have zero capacity for that higher level thinking that the next level requires. You can't think strategically when you're drowning tactically. And leaders can see that. The person who is constantly reactive, constantly in execution mode, constantly stretched thin, they don't read as someone ready for more responsibility. So, this conversation is not about working less, it's about working at the right level. So, here's what you can say. To do this new work well, here's what I'd prioritize. What would you want me to deprioritize to make room for it? And that framing is important. You're not saying no, you're asking for guidance on trade offs. That's a strategic conversation, and that demonstrates, that sends a strong signal that that's the kind of thinking that makes leaders trust you with more responsibility, more leadership. And the fifth conversation is the advancement conversation. The question here is, what does it actually take to move forward? And this is the one that people avoid for the longest because it feels vulnerable. It puts your ambition right out there on the table. It opens the door to a not yet that can feel stinging. But here's what I want you to hear. The professionals who advance the fastest are almost always the ones who made their ambition known clearly and professionally and early. And then they ask for specific guidance on what readiness looks like. Not because ambition alone gets you promoted, but because your manager cannot advocate for you in conversations that you don't know about, for a timeline you've never discussed, towards goals you've never expressed. Nina was a client who had been a strong performer for 2 years. She had a great reputation. She was genuinely ready, and she'd been waiting patiently and faithfully for the promotion conversation to find her, to come to her. And when she finally initiated it herself, her manager's response stopped her cold. Well, gosh, I didn't realize you were interested in moving up right now. 2 years, and her manager didn't know. Within 6 months of that conversation, Nina was on a formal promotion track, a timeline, a development plan, a clear set of milestones. Nothing had changed about her performance. Nothing changed about her capability. But the conversation, that had changed everything. And I cannot tell you how many times I have heard senior leaders tell this to me and actually asked me to encourage their teams to say, hey, if you've got ambition, if you want to grow, you need to tell us. You need to spearhead that conversation. You own your career. We are busy leading the organization. We're busy leading the department, leading the company. We need to know from the people who have that drive. We need to know it from them because we can't be all the time thinking about how do I bring this person up? And maybe it's the person who is not really right, not really interested in that next level. So they're counting on you to be the one to do it. So here's what you can say. I'm really focused on growing into the next level, and I want to be intentional about it. What would you need to see from me? And what's the realistic timeline that we're working toward? That's the question that plants a flag. It says, I am serious, I am self aware, and I want to work toward this with you rather than around you. And most managers respond to that with more openness than you'd expect. So, here's what I don't want you to do with this. We've talked about the 5 conversations, but I don't want you to walk away from this whole topic with a list of 5 conversations you're going to have before the end of the month, because that's not how it works. And trying to do all 5 at once is a great way to do none of them well. Here's what I want you to do instead. Pick one, just one. The one that you've been putting off the longest, the one that made you a little uncomfortable when I described it. Because that little discomfort, that's your sign that that's the one. Now, here's how to prepare for it. Before you go in, write down 2 or 3 genuine comments and questions that you want answered. Not talking points, not a script, questions. because the best version of any of these conversations is one that's driven by curiosity, not an agenda. Go in grounded, go in open, go in with the intention to understand, not just for them to understand you. And then go ahead and have that conversation. You don't have to have it perfectly, not with every single word calibrated. Just have the conversation. Because, look, an imperfect conversation that happens beats a perfect conversation that never happens. Careers don't move forward on effort alone. They move forward on clarity, and clarity gets created through conversation. Your manager can't read your mind. Leadership cannot see your ambition if you've never expressed it. Nobody can close a gap that they don't know exists. Conversation is how you make the invisible visible. And the professionals who rise, well, they have learned to initiate. So, your question for this week is, what conversation are you avoiding right now? Not the conversation that would be nice to have, the conversation that you've been putting off, the one where something in you says, I should really address this. And then you find a reason not to. Well, that's where to start. Pick the conversation. Decide when you're going to have it. Not sometime this month, but a specific day. And prepare 2 or 3 genuine questions to bring into it. Because your career is not going to move forward because someone above you finally noticed. It's going to move forward because you started the conversation that made it impossible not to. So go have it, and I'll see you next week.